Imagine being remembered not for your life, not for your thoughts or dreams, but for the sheer number of children you were forced to father. Over 200 of them. Like a prized animal in a cruel experiment. This isn't a myth. It's not a fable told around a campfire. It's a documented horror, a reality etched into the dark corners of human history. It's the story of Pataseca, a towering enslaved man, over 7 feet tall, used not for his labor, but for his genetics. A man reduced to a breeding machine, whose children became currency, whose body became property. And this didn't happen in some ancient forgotten empire. It happened right here in the 19th century America's dot. And if this story moves you, if it provokes outrage or stirs even a flicker of empathy, please like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. We dive deep into the hidden histories that were left out of the textbooks, the voices buried beneath the weight of time. Share this with someone who needs to know, because we owe it to Pataseca and to millions like him to confront this truth and make sure such horrors never take root again. In the early 1800s, the world began taking tentative steps toward ending the transatlantic slave trade. In 1808, the United States and Britain banned the importation of African slaves. Ships would no longer legally carry chained men, women, and children from the coasts of West Africa to the Americas. But while the international trade was shut down, slavery itself remained. And inside the plantation walls of Brazil, a more sinister system took root, one that turned human reproduction into a calculated industry. That system was slave breeding. On a plantation deep within Brazil, one man became its most infamous symbol. Roque Jose Florencio, known as Pataseca, born in 1828 in Angola, he was ripped from his homeland and transported across the ocean, forced into bondage in a world he never chose. From the beginning, Pataseca was different. Towering over 7 feet tall and weighing more than 300 pounds, he stood out. His physical power and genetic makeup were seen not as gifts, but as resources to exploit. He was renamed Pataseca, meaning dry leg in Portuguese, likely referring to his towering legs and lean, muscular form. From the moment he arrived, he was examined like livestock. His height, his posture, his teeth, his skin, his muscle density, everything about him was scrutinized by slaveholders who saw not a man, but a means to an end. They were not interested in his thoughts, his past, his hopes. They were only interested in what he could produce. Pataseca was not worked to death in the fields. Instead, he was kept for another purpose. His owner saw him as a tool to breed a stronger generation of slaves. Women were selected and sent to him. No consent, no dignity, no humanity. Pataseca became a father not through love, but through force. The children born from these unions were not celebrated as family, but counted as assets. Slavery had taken his freedom, now it took his legacy. Slave breeding was not an accidental practice. It was an economic strategy. With the importation of African slaves no longer legal, plantation owners needed a new supply. Instead of bringing in more slaves, they decided to grow their own. Enslaved men and women became instruments in a macabre reproduction scheme. Strong men like Pataseca were forced to mate with multiple women, while enslaved women were forced to bear children year after year. Over the decades, Pataseca was forced to father more than 200 children. Each child represented another brick in the slave economy's foundation, born into chains, raised to labor, destined to repeat the cycle. These children were measured, inspected, and sold as commodities. Some of them were kept on the plantation. Others were traded or gifted. His body was a factory. His children were products. In Santa Eudoxia, São Carlos, nearly 30% of the current population can trace their lineage back to him. His DNA became a commodity. But he never knew most of these children. He never held them as a father should. They were taken from their mothers and reassigned as laborers. The bonds of blood were meaningless in the eyes of the system. Despite all this, Pataseca endured. He lived through brutality that would break most men. He watched women cry as they were sent to him, knowing what was expected. He watched as babies were taken away, never to be seen again. He listened to the whip crack in the distance, knowing that any resistance meant punishment for him or for others. His silence was not acceptance. It was survival. And he survived. By 1888, Brazil became the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. Pataseca, now 60 years old, was a free man. But what did freedom mean to a man who had never been allowed to live his own life? Who had been used as a tool since adolescence? Still, he walked away from the plantation, not as a broken man, but as a living testament to the strength of the human spirit. He did not disappear into obscurity. Pataseca became a leader in his community. He helped newly freed people find homes, jobs, and purpose. He shared what little he had. He spoke of Angola, of his village, of what had been taken from him. And slowly, the people began to see not just a giant of a man, but a giant in heart. He eventually married a woman named Palmyra. For the first time, he had a choice. Together, they had 9 children. These were not children taken from him by force. They were family. He sang to them. He taught them to walk, to speak, to laugh. He told them stories that had been told to him in his childhood, before the ships came. One day, while walking through a field, Pataseca stepped on a nail. The wound seemed minor, but medical care was scarce. He received attention from a local healer, but the infection spread. Tetanus took hold. His muscles locked, his body shook, and after weeks of suffering, the man who had survived a century of slavery, breeding, and forced isolation finally succumbed. He was 130 years old. Every year on June 13th, in Santa Eudoxia, his descendants gather. Some carry his height, some carry his eyes. All carry his story. They speak of him not as a victim, but as a patriarch, as a man whose legacy was taken, then reclaimed, as a symbol of what was done and what must never be done again. And that's why we tell this story, not to shock, but to remember, not to pity, but to learn. Because in telling Pataseca's story, we unearth the brutal truths of a system that dehumanized millions. We name the crimes that history tried to bury. And in doing so, we reclaim the humanity of those who lived and died under that system. So if this story moved you, if it opened your eyes or weighed heavy on your heart, please like this video. Leave a comment to keep the conversation going. Subscribe for more stories that matter. Stories that challenge. Stories that should never be forgotten. Because history isn't just about what happened. It's about what we do with the truth today.
Imagine being remembered not for your life, not for your thoughts or dreams, but for the sheer number of children you were forced to father, over 200 of them, like a prized animal in a cruel experiment. This isn't a myth or a fable, it's a documented horror. It's the story of Pataseca, a towering enslaved man used as a human stud by his master, and it happened not in some ancient forgotten empire, but in the 19th century, in the Americas. His body became a breeding machine, his children became currency, and the system that demanded it, one of the most sinister institutions in human history, slave breeding. In the early 1800s, as the world took tentative steps toward outlawing the transatlantic slave trade, an even more insidious chapter began to unfold behind plantation walls. In January 1808, the United States and Britain permanently banned the importation of African slaves. Ships would no longer carry chained men, women, and children from the coasts of West Africa to the Americas. at least not legally. But abolition of the slave trade did not mean abolition of slavery, quite the opposite. This shift ignited panic among slaveholders. Their supply of enslaved labor was drying up, even as the demand for it reached unprecedented heights. The American South and the Caribbean were in the midst of a massive agricultural boom. Cotton, rice, and sugar were no longer just crops, they were the engines of empires. The cotton gin, recently invented by Eli Whitney, made it possible to process short staple cotton far more efficiently. Suddenly, land previously considered useless was now a goldmine, if only there were enough enslaved people to work it. But disease, malnutrition, grueling hours, and relentless abuse ensured that slave mortality remained high. With no new Africans arriving and with existing populations declining, plantation owners turned to a chillingly calculated alternative: reproduction by force. Thus began the era of systematic slave breeding. Women were reduced to reproductive vessels, men to genetic stock. Human beings became self-replicating property. Female slaves were forced to bear child after child, with no regard for their health, consent, or emotional well-being. And towering, strong-bodied men were chosen to impregnate them, not once but repeatedly across dozens of women. This was not a fringe practice. It was mainstream, orchestrated, and deliberately cruel. This is the world that forged the legend of Pataseca, also known as Patasa, or by his full name, Jose Florencio Pateca. He was an enslaved African born in Brazil, a country that would not abolish slavery until 1888, the last in the Western world to do so. But long before that, Pataseca's fate was sealed. He was a giant of a man, 7 feet, 2 inches tall, with disproportionately long legs and huge hands and feet. Among the enslaved, he was nicknamed Pataseca, meaning dry paw, perhaps a nod to his unusual build or a dark joke about his condition. But to his master, Francisco Duna Bueno, Pataseca's body was a gold mine. Pataseca was spared field labor. Instead, he was given unusual privileges for an enslaved person. He delivered messages, tended livestock, and rode horseback between farms and towns. But his real assignment was far more disturbing. He was chosen to be a breeder. Slaveholders believed certain physical traits were hereditary. Tall, strong men were expected to sire similarly strong offspring. Light skin, angular faces, and specific body proportions were all considered desirable traits that could boost the value of a slave on the market. So men like Pataseca were forced into sexual encounters with enslaved women, selected for breeding, sometimes daily. These were not intimate relationships. They were violent acts of institutionalized rape. Pataseca had no choice. He was compelled to father child after child, each one born into bondage, each one counted not as family, but as capital. To plantation owners, these children were future laborers, future profit, future currency, and Pataseca, he was no more than a cog in the reproductive machine. Today, it's estimated that around 30% of the modern population in the Santa Eudoxia district of São Carlos, Brazil, can trace their lineage back to him. His genes spread not by legacy, but by force. But this is not a story of legacy, it's a story of loss. Pataseca never met the majority of his children. He never got to hold them, name them, raise them. They were taken from their mothers, often before they could walk. They were sold to distant plantations, separated from their siblings, and stripped of any familial identity. These children were doomed to live as tools, picking cotton under the scorching sun, cleaning houses for the very people who enslaved their parents, enduring beatings for minor infractions, and being denied education to ensure their obedience. Educating an enslaved child was considered dangerous. Knowledge could spark rebellion. And so, entire generations were kept ignorant on purpose, forced to grow up without literacy, hope, or the freedom to imagine a better life. The brutality these children endured was relentless. They were whipped, shackled, and humiliated. Their innocence was stolen, their emotions dismissed, their pain normalized. And all the while, Pataseca remained a prisoner of flesh, treated as valuable livestock. His health was monitored. His food was better than that of the field slaves, not out of kindness, but to preserve his breeding potential. His entire worth was tied to his ability to reproduce. This system didn't just commodify people, it reprogrammed generations to see themselves as worthless. It destroyed families before they could begin. Yet Pataseca endured, and when Brazil finally abolished slavery in 1888, his life changed. He was given a plot of land by his former master, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of gratitude for the hundreds of enslaved laborers Pataseca had helped create. On that land, Pataseca built something of his own. He married a woman named Palmyra, and together they raised 9 children, the only children he would ever truly know. He named his land Sitio Poasa and began producing rapadura, a raw cane sugar sold in blocks. It was backbreaking work, but it was his farm, his family, his freedom. For the first time in his life, Pataseca lived as a man, not a commodity, but there remained a permanent, aching void. He never reunited with the hundreds of children he had fathered during his enslavement. There were no records to trace them, no names to search, no paper trail, because they had never been treated like people to begin with. That is perhaps the most haunting part of Pataseca's legacy, the erasure of bloodlines, the destruction of roots, the deliberate forgetting. His story is not one of triumph but of endurance, of a man who lived through systemic sexual exploitation, who became the foundation for an entire community's genetic lineage, yet died never knowing who his children became. This is the untold story of slavery, not just chains and whips, but of forced reproduction, stolen parenthood, and the cold arithmetic of human profit. The story of Pataseca reveals the industrial scale of cruelty masked behind the polite veils of agriculture and commerce. And for every Pataseca, there were hundreds more whose names we'll never know. We remember him not just for the children he was forced to father, but for surviving a system that tried to strip him of everything that made him human.